Hey guys, today I'm looking at LOCOS by Felipe Alfau. A long time ago when I was a student slash dilettante, I took it upon myself to visit the Pakistani writer Zulfikar Ghose, and I had these fantasies of having long spirited discussions about writers like Patrick White and Claude Simon. But when I got there, Ghose was like, and after a couple minutes he had kicked me out of his office, but not before I had snatched off his desk a sheet of paper which contained reading recommendations. I treated this like a literary treasure map over the years, and one of the writers on this list I noticed was Felipe Alfau. Felipe Alfau was born in 1902, and he was just a couple years younger than Hemingway and Faulkner, and he died in 1999. And throughout his life he was kind of like a literary ghost. He had published this book at the age of 34. It was published by Farrar and Reinhardt. Right. Alfau, they put him out in a series called the Discover series, which was like a subscription-based club, and they had a very short run, just a couple thousand, and Alfau just said, like, the book wasn't really read that much. When it came out, it was reviewed here and there, and the reviews were favorable. Mary McCarthy reviewed it in The Nation, but then it just kind of went into obscurity. And then in 1987, the critic Stephen Moore discovered this book at a barn sale in Massachusetts, the story goes, and he had read like maybe 10 pages of it and knew that he had on his hands a major discovery. This book was doing postmodernism at a time when modernism was still in full bloom. This was in the 30s, and sometimes when you pick up a book you can see where it's drawing its influences. Like this book, for instance, you think maybe John Barth, John Hawkes, Flann O'Brien, Calvino, Borges, but then you realize that this book preceded all of those books. It would have been impossible for it to have been influenced by those writers, and in fact you start to think about it in reverse, that this book must have influenced all the writers that came after decades later, that this book was so far ahead of its time. And I really wondered about that, and I asked Stephen Moore about that. I said, is it true that he was really a literary ghost this whole time, or did he influence the people that you suspected he influenced, and did they ever acknowledge it? And Stephen Moore said that to his knowledge, no one practicing postmodernism was aware of this writer, Alfau. So in a sense, it's kind of amazing, because it seems like he was in an alternate dimension and this book existed, and it was just pure luck that Moore had uncovered it, republished it. He got in touch with Alfau, looked him up in the phone book, and he was living in New York, and he reached out to the writer and republished this work with his permission. Alfau at the time was so old that he really didn't care, and any money that the book would have earned, he said to just donate to other writers. Like, he had no use for money at the time. And I believe Adalki Archive was kind of having some financial troubles, and this book helped turn it around, supposedly. Although I don't really hear anyone talk about Alfau at all. I see his name listed first a lot of times in the backlist here, just because of alphabetical ordering. But and yeah, he did publish another novel. Adalki Archive did, because Moore had asked him if he had written anything else, and Alfau said that he'd written another novel in the 40s but never could get it published, and it just sat in a drawer. It was called Chromos, and Moore had taken it, published it, and it was nominated for the National Book Award in the 90s. And when Stephen Moore and an associate went over to visit Alfau in his nursing home, I believe, and he was like in his 90s, to tell him the news about the nomination, like Alfau sort of had this like slamming the door in their face type reaction. Like, he truly did not care at the time. I don't think it was really so much that he was bitter that he was ignored over the years, and that his influence just was never acknowledged. I think it was more the fact that he was just too old to appreciate it at the time, and that he just wanted to die. English was this author's second language. He had immigrated from Spain to America when he was 14, and the writing is impeccable. It's just this kind of traditional Scheherazade type storytelling. In the author's prologue, he describes up front that you can just take any chapter and read it in any order, and also he kind of mentions that like these characters kind of went away from his control, and sometimes, like later on in the book, in footnotes, he would like mention gleefully that he's wresting control back from these characters, like they were going to do something and he kind of distracts them. Very much kind of acknowledging the artifice of creation. It gets drawn out a little bit, and I feel like it was too apologetic, you know. But at the time, I'm sure there wasn't a whole lot of practitioners of the sort of self-aware, self-referentiality aspect of fiction making, so you can kind of see why he was doing that. Really, the remarkable thing here is the set of characters, and there's usually an older man, a younger man, and a young girl, and they all take on different names over time, different roles and relationships to each other. The character named Flann, whose notable characteristic is that he's just ignored by everybody. He's almost like a ghost in their midst, and he bemoans this condition, and he hangs out at this cafe, the Cafe de los Locos, which is in the title here. It's a cafe in Toledo, but this book also, you know, may take place in Madrid. It's kind of fluid that way. Flann tries to impress himself upon the artists that hang out at this cafe so that they can immortalize him in their works. And there's like, well, what's your defining characteristic? And he's like, well, it's that I'm a flat character and totally unremarkable. The artists are like, well, literature is already filled with those types of characters. Flann goes to this character named Dr. Jose de los Rios, which is almost like this quack-like doctor who gives advice to characters here and there, and usually the advice is that the character just commits suicide, and that's the solution, which sometimes works out for the characters. A whole host of other characters like a nun, a monk, a prefect of police, a fingerprint expert, and there's, you know, just reading these stories and going back to them, you kind of want to pull together all these threads and figure out what the logic is, because that's what the challenging thing about this book is, because I think it takes multiple rereadings and it's very hard to grasp. But you can see that Alfau, in that regard, with the interrelated stories idea, sometimes the author, you feel like they don't have any control over their material and they just kind of leave it as a mess. But in this case, I feel like Alfau was in control and he had his own logic that he wanted to follow. And what was interesting about him was that he admitted that he wasn't really into literature at all, which is amazing given the quality of this work. It's really kind of a cerebral, excitingly cerebral, and impeccably written for somebody who didn't consider himself a writer. I think he considered himself more of a failed musician, and he was more interested in mathematics and logic. And you can see in this book, I think he was more trying to follow his own idea of the logic of this story to its conclusion, and to do so without really being concerned with what the audience would think. And yet he was still able to write a very entertaining and engaging work here. It's very different from his personality later on, because, you know, the people, Dalkey Archive and the Review of Contemporary Fiction crowd, you know, tried to get in touch with him later on when he was really old, and at that point he was like a totally different person. He just had no use for literature or interest in it. Almost like two different people when he was a young man versus when he was really old. Just the same body, but almost like two different people. But yeah, I think if you enjoy postmodern writers, you know, the serious postmodern writers like John Hawkes and William Gass, or even like the whimsical, cynical postmodernists like
Coover,
Gilbert Sorrentino. I'm more like into like the serious style of writing. Actually, I tried reading Chromos, which was the other novel that was published quite a while ago. I just couldn't gel with the comedy aspect of it. But yeah, I think this book really would hit the sweet spot for, you know, those either side. And I think if you're just a student or fan of postmodern literature, you know, you may want to pick this up and take a look at it just to be aware that it exists, and I think needs to be part of the discussion, you know, just with literary history, kind of like in the same way that you'd want to read Tristram Shandy. But this has been a review of Locos by Felipe Alfau.